A light rain fell over Lisbon, coating the ancient cobblestones of the Alfama district with a gentle shine. Inside a small family restaurant tucked between historic buildings, a little girl in a white dress sat in the corner, her eyes red from crying, clutching a worn teddy bear tightly to her chest. The young waitress in her faded apron placed a bowl of soup on the table with gentle care. Suddenly, the child looked up through her tears and whispered, "Can you be my mommy?" The father, a CEO in an expensive suit, stood frozen, his silver spoon clattering onto the cold stone table. Outside, the melancholic sound of fado music drifted through the rain-soaked streets. Sofia Cardoso was 26 years old and had spent most of her life learning to live without the word mother. Orphaned as an infant and raised in a children's home in Porto, she had grown up watching other children get adopted, always wondering what it would feel like to have someone call her by that sacred title. Now she worked the evening shift at Casa de Mar, a modest restaurant in Lisbon's oldest neighborhood. The pay was barely enough to cover her rent and the night courses she was taking, but the work gave her something precious: the chance to take care of people, even if just for the duration of a meal. Sofia had a peculiar habit that the restaurant owner found charming. Whenever business was slow, she would fold napkins into the shape of swans. It was something she learned from a kind nurse at the orphanage, and the simple act of creating something beautiful from something ordinary brought her comfort during long, lonely shifts. That rainy Tuesday evening, Miguel Santos walked into the restaurant holding his 6-year-old daughter Isabela's hand. He was a striking figure, tall, distinguished, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of boardrooms and business deals, but his eyes carried a heaviness that wealth couldn't cure. Miguel was the CEO of a successful tech company, living in one of Lisbon's modern skyline towers. But for the past year, since his wife's death in a terrible boating accident during a storm, he had been drowning in a different kind of chaos. The impossible task of being both father and mother to a little girl who had stopped speaking for 3 months after losing her mama. They had just come from another late meeting where Miguel had tried to juggle conference calls while Isabela sat quietly in the corner of his office, coloring pictures of a family that no longer existed. "Table for two?" Sofia asked with her warm smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made people feel seen. Miguel nodded, and Sofia led them to a quiet corner table near the window, where the sound of rain created a soothing rhythm against the glass. As Sofia brought water and bread to the table, she noticed the little girl's red eyes and the way she clutched her teddy bear like it was the only stable thing in her world. "What's your bear's name?" Sofia asked gently, crouching down to Isabela's eye level. Isabela looked at her father, then back at Sofia, and whispered, "Ursinho." "Mama gave him to me." Sofia's heart clenched. She recognized that look, the desperate sadness of a child trying to hold on to a memory that was fading too fast. "Ursinho is very lucky to have you," Sofia said softly. "Would you like some soup?" "It's my grandmother's recipe." "Well, not my actual grandmother, but the cook here is like a grandmother to me." She brought a bowl of caldo verde, the traditional Portuguese soup, and placed it carefully in front of Isabela. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the comforting scent of potatoes and kale. That's when it happened. Isabela looked up at Sofia with eyes that held more pain than any child should carry, and through her tears, she asked the question that would change 3 lives forever. "Can you be my mommy?" The restaurant seemed to stop. The fado music playing softly in the background stretched into a long, mournful note. Miguel's hand froze halfway to his wine glass, his face a mixture of shock and grief. Sofia felt tears spring to her own eyes. In all her years of longing to hear those words, she had never imagined they would come from a stranger's child in a moment of desperate sorrow. Miguel apologized profusely and paid quickly, leading a confused and crying Isabela out into the rain. But the next evening, something unexpected happened. He returned this time with just his daughter. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Miguel said as Sofia approached their table. "Isabela has been struggling since we lost her mother. I think she saw something in you that reminded her of before." Sofia shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. I understand grief. It makes us reach for whatever light we can find." To her own surprise, Sofia found herself sitting down at their table during her break, She brought 3 warm pastéis de nata, the classic Portuguese custard tarts or still warm from the oven. These were my favorite when I was little, Sofia said, sliding one toward Isabela. The nuns at the orphanage would give us one every Sunday after church. Isabela looked up, suddenly interested. You lived in an orphanage? Yes, from the time I was a baby until I was 18, Sofia replied honestly. She had learned long ago that children appreciated truth more than sugar-coated stories. Did you have a mama? Isabela asked. Sofia felt the familiar ache but kept her voice steady. No, sweetie. I never got to know my mother, but I learned that family can be the people who choose to love you, not just the ones you're born to. Miguel watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, he'd tried everything to reach his daughter. Therapists, specialists, family members, but no one had been able to break through Isabela's wall of grief quite like this young waitress was doing with simple honesty and a custard tart. My mama died in a boat, Isabela said quietly, looking down at her teddy bear. Papa says she's in heaven now, but I don't understand why heaven needed her more than I did. Sofia's eyes met Miguel's across the table, and in that moment, they shared an understanding that transcended words. The recognition of 2 people who had both lost something irreplaceable. Your mama loved you very much, Sofia said gently, and I bet she would want you to keep being brave, keep eating pastéis de nata, and keep hugging Ursinho. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to develop. Miguel and Isabela started coming to the restaurant several times a week. Sometimes they would stay after closing, and Sofia would sit with them while the old radiator hummed and the windows fogged with condensation. Miguel shared his story, how he and his wife Katerina had built a life together, how they dreamed of filling their modern apartment with children's laughter, how the storm had come out of nowhere during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary cruise. I'm failing her, Miguel confessed one night after Isabela had fallen asleep in the booth, her head on the worn teddy bear. I'm failing at work because I can't concentrate, and I'm failing Isabela because I don't know how to be what she needs. You're here, Sofia replied simply. You're showing up. That's more than some people get. She told him her own story. The years of watching other children leave with families while she remained behind, the foster homes that never quite worked out, the loneliness of aging out of the system with no one to call when life got hard. I used to think I was broken because no one chose me, Sofia admitted, but I realized now that maybe I was just waiting to find where I really belonged. Isabela started coming to the restaurant earlier in the evenings, helping Sofia fold napkins into swans while Miguel finished conference calls from a corner table. The little girl's laughter began to return, like spring flowers pushing through winter snow. One morning, Sofia arrived to find Isabela already at the restaurant with Miguel, who had brought her before school. The child had wanted to help Sofia prepare for the day, and Miguel hadn't had the heart to say no. As Sofia watched Isabela carefully arrange the swan napkins on each table, something shifted in her heart. She looked at the shelf behind the counter and realized she had unconsciously set out 3 coffee cups instead of her usual one, as if she'd been expecting them to become part of her routine. Miguel noticed the 3 cups too, and their eyes met with a mixture of hope and fear. They both understood they were walking into something neither had planned, something that could heal them or hurt them in equal measure. Sofia, Miguel said quietly that evening as Isabela colored at their usual table, I need you to know that what's happening here, it's not just Isabela who's been affected. You've reminded me that there's still light in the world, even after the darkest storms. Sofia felt her heart race. Miguel, I'm just a waitress with a faded apron and no family to speak of. Your daughter deserves... My daughter deserves someone who sees her pain and doesn't look away, Miguel interrupted gently. Someone who knows what it's like to need a family and doesn't take that gift for granted. Someone exactly like you. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the evening lights of Alfama were beginning to glow against the darkening sky. Inside the small restaurant, 3 people who had been lost were starting to find their way home. But Sofia knew that this fragile new beginning was about to be tested in ways none of them were prepared for. The testing came in the form of Señora Duarte, Miguel's former mother-in-law, a woman of considerable wealth and even more considerable opinions about what was proper for her granddaughter. She arrived at the restaurant unannounced one evening, her designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair standing in stark contrast to the humble surroundings. With her came an air of authority that had been honed through decades of social prominence in Lisbon's elite circles. "Miguel," she said, her voice cold and formal, "we need to discuss Isabela's future, and it should happen somewhere more appropriate than this place." But Isabela, seeing her grandmother, ran not to her, but to Sofia, wrapping her small arms around the waitress's waist and burying her face in the faded apron. Senora Duarte's eyes narrowed. "I see. So the rumors are true. You've been bringing my granddaughter to spend time with service workers." Miguel stood up, his jaw tight. "Mother Duarte, with respect." "Respect?" the older woman interrupted. "Where is the respect for Katerina's memory? Where is the respect for our family's standing? Miguel, you're a CEO. Your daughter is heiress to the Santos fortune. This situation is inappropriate." She placed a leather folder on the table. Inside were legal documents, a petition for custody that would give Senora Duarte primary guardianship of Isabela, with Miguel reduced to supervised visits. "I've already spoken with my lawyers," she said coldly. "I can provide Isabela with the best schools, the finest tutors, the social connections she'll need." "What can you offer her? Late nights in restaurants? The company of strangers? A father too distracted by work to raise her properly?" Miguel looked at the documents, feeling the walls closing in. Part of him knew that Senora Duarte could provide things he couldn't. Stability, resources, a traditional family structure. Maybe his daughter would be better off. "No," the word came from Sofia, who had been silent until now. She gently moved Isabela behind her and faced Senora Duarte directly. "With all respect, Senora, you're wrong. Isabela doesn't need another mansion or another tutoring session. She needs love. She needs someone who sees her grief and doesn't try to buy it away with expensive things. She needs what every child needs: to be chosen, to be valued, to be home." Senora Duarte's eyes flashed. "And you think you're qualified to tell me what my granddaughter needs? You, who serve soup for a living? You, who have no education, no family, no standing in society?" Sofia felt the old wounds threatening to open, but she stood firm. "You're right. I have no education beyond high school. I have no family to speak of, but I know what it's like to be a child who needs someone to stay, and I know that love isn't measured by bank accounts." The restaurant had gone silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped to listen. Miguel looked at Sofia with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Then he looked at his daughter, who was peeking out from behind Sofia's apron with terrified eyes, clearly afraid that the grandmother who represented rules and expectations would take her away from the woman who had become her safe harbor. In that moment, Miguel saw his life diverge into two paths. One led back to his old world, the world of appearance and duty, where his daughter would grow up in privilege but perhaps never feel truly loved. The other path led somewhere unknown, somewhere that scared him, but somewhere that felt like home. He picked up his late wife's wedding ring, which he had been carrying in his pocket since her death, unable to let go. Senora Duarte had given it to him earlier, thinking it would remind him of his duty to Katerina's memory. "Mother Duarte," Miguel said quietly, holding the ring up to the light, "Katerina wrote something in her will that I haven't shared with anyone. She wrote, 'If you find someone who is lost, don't let them eat alone.' My mother taught me that family is not about blood, but about who shares your table." He placed the ring back in his pocket. Katerina would have loved Sofia. She would have understood that grief sometimes leads us to exactly where we're meant to be. Miguel turned to the custody papers and, without hesitation, tore them in half. "I won't sign away my daughter. And I won't let you teach her that love can be bought or that some people are worth more than others because of their bank accounts." Senora Duarte's face hardened. "You're making a terrible mistake, Miguel. One day you'll realize that sentiment doesn't pay for university or provide security." "Maybe," Miguel acknowledged, "but sentiment teaches my daughter that she's worth more than a trust fund, that her heart matters more than her pedigree, and that the woman who chose to love us when she had no obligation to, that woman has more value than all the social standing in Lisbon." Isabela suddenly broke free from behind Sofia and ran to her grandmother. For a moment, everyone thought she might be choosing the older woman's offer of stability. Instead, Isabela looked up at Senora Duarte with tear-filled eyes and said, "I don't want a castle, Avo. I just want a home." And Sofia makes it feel like home. The little girl ran back to Sofia, who knelt down and wrapped her arms around the child. "I've got you, querida," Sofia whispered. "I've got you." Senora Duarte stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the three of them, the successful CEO, the orphaned waitress, and the grieving child who had somehow found each other in the midst of loss. Finally she spoke, her voice softer than before. "Katerina used to bring home stray cats and injured birds. She said everything deserves a chance to belong somewhere." She paused. Perhaps she was right. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Miguel, don't make me regret this. That child is all I have left of my daughter." "I know," Miguel replied, "and I promise you she'll know she's loved. By all of us." As Senora Duarte disappeared into the Lisbon night, Sofia slowly sank into a chair, the weight of what had just happened finally hitting her. "I have nothing," she whispered. "Nothing but this old apron and a job that barely pays rent. How can I—" Miguel knelt beside her chair, taking her hand gently. Katerina also wrote in her will, "If you meet someone wandering, don't let them sit alone at dinner. Sofia, you've been wandering all your life. Please don't sit alone anymore." The weeks that followed the confrontation brought changes that surprised everyone, especially Sofia herself. She had spent 26 years believing she was destined to be alone, but suddenly she was learning what it meant to be chosen. Not just by a child seeking comfort, but by a family seeking to become whole again. Sofia continued working at Casa de Mar, but something had shifted in how she approached each day. She began teaching napkin folding to children who came to the restaurant on weekends, transforming the quiet Sunday mornings into impromptu art classes where little hands learned to create swans from simple cloth. Isabela became her most dedicated assistant, arriving early with Miguel to help set up the tables, carefully placing a folded swan at each setting like a small gift of beauty for the people who would sit there. "Sofia taught me that making something pretty for someone else is a way of saying you matter," Isabela explained to her father one morning, her small face serious with the importance of the lesson. Miguel watched his daughter transform week by week. The silent, withdrawn child who had barely spoken for months was now chattering excitedly about napkin techniques and asking when they could invite her school friends to learn too. But more than Isabela was changing, Miguel himself was different. He started leaving work earlier, no longer feeling the need to prove his worth through endless hours at the office. He began to understand that success wasn't measured only in quarterly reports and stock prices, but in moments like watching his daughter laugh or seeing Sofia smile when she thought no one was looking. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them went to a garden shop together. It had been Sofia's idea. She wanted to plant something living outside the restaurant, something that would grow and bloom as a symbol of new beginnings. "These are hydrangeas," Sofia explained to Isabela, pointing to a plant with large blue blooms. "I used to dream about these when I was in the orphanage. There was a picture book that showed a house with blue hydrangeas growing by the door, and I thought that if I ever had a home, I would plant them there." "Let's plant them at the restaurant," Isabela exclaimed. "Then it really will be home." So they bought 3 hydrangea plants, one for each of them, Sofia explained, and spent the afternoon digging holes in the small patch of earth in front of Casa de Mar. The restaurant owner, who had been watching Sofia's transformation with knowing eyes, gave his blessing immediately. "That girl has been making this place feel like home for others long enough," he said to Miguel. "It's about time someone made it home for her too." As they worked, hands dirty with soil, Isabela asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Papa, is Sofia going to be my mama?" The question hung in the air. Miguel and Sofia looked at each other over Isabela's head, both unsure how to answer. Sofia was the one who spoke first, her voice gentle but honest. "Isabela, your mama will always be your mama. No one can replace her, and no one should try. But," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "but if we're not ready to decide everything right now, we can just take it day by day. We can be a family that's still learning how to be a family." "Like the hydrangeas," Isabela said thoughtfully. "They're not blooming yet, but they will. Exactly like the hydrangeas, Sofia agreed, feeling tears prick her eyes. Miguel reached across the small garden space and took Sofia's hand, dirt and all. My whole life I've been building things. Companies, buildings, investments. But I'm realizing that the most important thing I'll ever build is whatever this becomes. This family. This home. Home, Sofia repeated, the word feeling foreign and wonderful on her tongue. I've never really had one of those. You do now, Miguel said simply. The following weeks established new rhythms and routines. Miguel began teaching Isabela about architecture on Sunday mornings, using Sofia's napkin swans as inspiration for discussing how function and beauty could exist together. Sofia started attending Isabela's school events, standing nervously among the other mothers and slowly learning that she belonged there too. One evening, as they sat together in Casa de Mar after closing, the three of them and Ursinio the teddy bear, Isabela suddenly announced, I drew something at school today. She pulled out a piece of paper from her backpack. On it was a child's drawing of three figures holding hands in front of a building. Above them, in careful letters, she had written, My family. Sofia felt tears stream down her face, tears she didn't bother to hide. For years, she had folded napkins into swans, creating beauty from ordinary things because she needed to believe that transformation was possible. Now she understood that she herself had been transformed, from someone who served others to someone who belonged to them. Miguel pulled both Sofia and Isabela close, and for a long moment, they simply sat there in the warm light of the restaurant that had become their meeting place, their refuge, and the foundation of their unexpected family. On the shelf behind the counter, 3 white porcelain coffee cups stood waiting for morning. On the door, Isabela's drawing was taped proudly for all to see, and outside the blue hydrangeas were beginning to show their first tiny buds. 3 months later, on a morning that dawned clear and bright over Lisbon, Sofia stood in the kitchen of Casa do Mar preparing the day's first batch of pastel de nata. The familiar ritual had taken on new meaning. She was no longer cooking just for customers, but for the family that would arrive any moment. The restaurant had become something more than a workplace. The owner, seeing how things had evolved, had offered Sofia a partnership in the business. You've already made this place a home for so many people, he'd said. It's time you had an ownership stake in what you built. On the kitchen counter, 3 white coffee cups waited in a neat row, one for Miguel, one for Isabela, and one for Sofia. It was a small thing, but it represented everything. She was no longer setting out cups for customers, but for people who were hers. The door chimed, and Isabela burst in with her characteristic energy, Miguel following behind with a smile that had become frequent in recent weeks. Sofia! Sofia! My teacher said I can bring you to Career Day, Isabela announced. I want to tell everyone about how you teach people to make beautiful things and how you make the best custard tarts in all of Portugal. Sofia laughed, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. A new one that Miguel had given her, though she still kept the old one hanging in her locker like a reminder of where she'd come from. As Isabela ran to help set tables, Miguel approached Sofia, his expression serious but warm. I have something to ask you, he said quietly. Isabela and I have been talking, and we both agree. Our apartment downtown is too big and too empty, but there's a small house for sale in Alfama, just 2 streets over. It has a garden for hydrangeas and a kitchen window that looks out over the city. Sofia's heart began to race. Miguel, we want you to live with us, he said simply.